This is the third interview for the Integral Stage Psychology series. We're trying to get a sense of the theoretical overview of various integrative and meta-level approaches to psychology, but also a sense of what's working therapeutically, what's emerging, what are the nuances, and who are the people drawn to this stuff? What does it mean to them? Joining us today is a specialist in integral relational psychotherapy, co-editor and author of The Spiritual Psyche and Psychotherapy. Let's welcome Willow Pearson, PsyD, LMFT, MTBC. Hi, Willow.
Hi, Layman.
Why don't you tell us where you are and also what the heck all those letters after your name stand for?
Sure. So I am talking to you from Oakland, California, in the beautiful Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, in the Bay Area of Northern California. And all those crazy letters just map out part of my own little journey through psychology. So maybe I can speak to them from that perspective. I started out with my formal training in psychotherapy by entering into the transpersonal counseling psychology program at Naropa University with a specialization in music therapy. So the MTBC, people sometimes think it means massage therapist or something. It doesn't mean that. It means music therapist board certified. So it's a national certification for music therapy. And after I did the master's program in transpersonal counseling psych, that's actually when I came into contact with Ken and his work in integral psychotherapy, was during my days at Naropa back in, I think it was around 96, when the Integral Institute started to get underway, around 96, 97. And so during that whole time that I was training at Naropa, I was also immersing myself in integral psychotherapy and psychology, sort of in tandem. And that started its own leg of the journey for the next probably 15 years or so of going deeply into the maps and then the territory. And then I guess it was around 2010 that after a period of 3-year semi-retreat, I decided that I wanted to go back and get my doctorate because I love teaching so much. And that was one of the things that I so very enjoyed with the integral community, was teaching in the integral seminars. And so that gave me a taste for that love of teaching that I also developed at Naropa, where I was an adjunct faculty member for about 7 years. And I decided to go back and get my doctorate, which is the PsyD, PsyD. People sometimes don't know what that means either because it's not a PhD. But the only difference is, and it's actually quite relevant in terms of my path, so just continue the long wind about it, why not, is that it means that you're a doctorate in the clinical expression of psychology rather than the research expression of psychology. And so I decided to do my doctorate in a PsyD because it really is gaining your doctoral skill in the clinical application of psychology and psychotherapy. So the LMFT is the marriage and family therapist licensure that I got along the way. So I've combined my role as music therapist, as marriage and family therapist, and as doctoral licensed clinical psychologist. And all of those windows have been great portals into integral relational psychotherapy as I practice it now.
I'm curious about what drew you to music, because it seems to me there are a lot of musical and acoustic metaphors for both integral thinking and spirituality in terms of resonance and orchestration and vibration and, the improvisational harmony of being in relational dialogue with people. What did draw you to music?
That's such a wonderful question. I've looked into it quite a bit, as you might imagine, because of the desire to focus my expression in psychology from a musical perspective. And I think the two things that first taught me about being in the world and in the cosmos at large are song and dreams. And I think the partnership between song and dreams has been a lifelong thread for me, taking me in and out of different realms of psychology. And I actually did a paper that's on my website as an article that's on the music of the integral spheres and orbits, where I talk a little bit about that in detail for anybody who's interested.
Dreams are fascinating. When I spoke with Mark Foreman, I asked him, what are the most important elements of the therapeutic engagement? He said, by far, active listening is the most important element. But for him, the second most important element was dream analysis. What's your integrally informed take on dream analysis, both with clients, but also with yourself? How do you approach the subject matter of dreams?
Such a wonderful question. I so appreciate it. It's a very passionate topic for me and always has been. I have a few writings on it that I can draw from in answering your question, Layman. One is an article I wrote for the Integral Journal that's called Dreaming Integral. And you'll notice that the title is Dreaming Integral rather than Integral Dreaming, because the dreaming comes first, and out of dreams came the integral map or ideas, right? That it comes, the idea that from the unmanifest comes the manifest, and that it's always this, even to say it like that definitively, of course, is positing something that's a concept, because who can ever say what comes first exactly, or how they interweave or intermix or intermingle. But that's one writing, Dreaming Integral, from the Integral Journal, that I also have on my website. And then my most recent writing, which I'll answer more fully your question from, is a chapter from my book, The Spiritual Psyche and Psychotherapy, and it's called Caesuras of Dreaming, Being, Becoming, Thinking, and Imagining. And caesura is a term that comes out of both music, poetry, and the psychoanalytic tradition. And so I love thinking about it for that reason. And I'll just take a moment to describe what that is, because I think it shines a light on dreaming, which is why I included it in the title.
Sure.
Caesura in poetry means like a moment of silence, like a pause in a phrase. And in music, there's actually a symbol for caesura that has the same sense, that there's a pause, but it doesn't quite equal like a whole note or a value of a note. It's just like a pause. It's like it's there. It's like a trace. It's there. It's noticeable, but you can't quite grasp it. And caesura in its psychoanalytic context means sort of the idea of a permeable membrane. And I often liken it to the idea of something that you can join and separate at the same time. So for your audience who's very intimately familiar with the integral map and its concepts, you can think of the lines of the quadrants as a kind of caesura, in the sense that the quadrants represent not hard and fast lines, but a permeable membrane that denotes the four quadrants. So we can say how, looking into how the psychological in the upper left and the intrapsychic is connected to and inseparable from, and yet also separable from, the interpersonal in the lower left and in the lower right. And we can talk about how they're connected but separate. So why caesuras of dreaming is when I talked about caesuras of dreaming, being, becoming, thinking, and imagining, I'm holding all of those four realities as being caesuras of dreaming, so that we can think of, we often think of becoming as a dream, like what it means to emerge. We think of emergence as a dream, and we often think of imagining as a dream. But I also wanted to think about the very substrate of our existence, of our very being, as a kind of dreaming. And not only that, but our thinking, which is probably most compelling for the integral audience to consider this idea of our very thinking is itself a kind of dreaming. And in that sense, you think of the bumper sticker, don't believe everything you think, right? And, it's a good one because it gets this idea of the power of our thought. It connotes something of the power of our thought and what an amazing tool our thought is. And also the sense of how can we regard our thinking itself as a kind of dreaming ourselves into existence, the good, the bad, and the ugly of that, as the bumper sticker points to, right?
That's lovely, and it's very, very high level, I think. Bruce Alderman, who's the producer of this series, he and I are
Yeah.
working on a book about generative permeable enclosures and the metaphysics of adjacency, which deals
Yes.
very much with, the lines on the map rather than
Yeah.
domains on the map as the more fundamental category.
Yeah.
So I think it's really applicable to the actual ontology of reality to think in terms of these caesuras.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me that title again. I want to hear it again.
Oh, it's our working title, but it's about the metaphysics of adjacency and generative enclosures, which are considered to be permeable.
Yeah.
Also, prepositional ontology, which is how Bruce likes to think. But these, the spaces between and the orienting ambiguity,
Yes.
and in fact, the almost considered as a more primary condition than certainties.
Absolutely. That's very akin to a really important theorist that I spend quite a bit of time with in my book, The Spiritual Psyche and Psychotherapy, who is Wilfred Bion. He was a luminary in psychoanalysis who passed on in the early 70s. And was it the early 70s or the late 70s? The 70s in any case. But he was president of the British Psychoanalytic Society in the 60s and came to the United States later in his career in LA. And he had a concept that has been so instrumental for me in my path in psychology and coming into contact with it, which is his idea of O. And he used O very much as both sign and symbol from my experience of having contact with his symbol, both to denote a sense of 0 point, a sense of origin, a sense of orgasm, a sense of original, but also as, a symbol as in including and going beyond all of those reference to expand our thinking to something that is preconceptual, which was the point of his using that symbol. It stands for basically the unthought, unknown, unknowable. And I mentioned that I spent about 15 years in the integral psychotherapy and psychology world, and I've spent the last probably 11 years in the relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy world, which is where I came into contact with Bion's ideas. And I'm really struck by, and have been in my writing expression as well, the parallels and convergences and mutual illumination of Bion's idea of O as holding a place for the unthought, unknowable, unknown, and the idea in integral psychology of the antecedent self, which I think is an undersung concept, which points so much to this land of the ambiguous territory that you express.
I have a slippery keyboard, and so sometimes when I try to type the letter I as a self-reference in whatever I'm writing, it slips to the one next to it and writes the O instead. And
Nice.
I'm very loath to change it back.
Yeah, right? There's something comforting about that 0.
Yeah. I read some of an article on your website about Bion that I think you co-authored with Grotstein.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask a little bit more about the distinction between binocular focus and reversible perspective.
Sure. Well, first I have to say it stops my heart to hear you talk about Dr. Grotstein, because he's really the person that brought me Bion through his writing, because I found, like many people, I found Bion quite difficult to access straight away. And so having interpreters of his work has been exceptional. And Dr. Grotstein is he just passed in 2015, sadly, but he wrote some amazing books, left us with some amazing books about understanding Bion's world and work, and continued it further. And one of them is, and this is a long circuitous route to your question, one of his books that I absolutely love is called A Beam of Intense Darkness. And it refers to an exchange in letters between Freud and another practitioner scholar. And when I hear that phrase, a beam of intense darkness, I take it as a psychoanalytic koan, because of course it stops your mind. A beam of intense darkness? What? And I think it's the perfect metaphor inside of that what for the unconscious. And the whole practice, of course, of relational psychoanalytic psychology takes us into a deep conversation between the conscious and unconscious dimensions of mind. And Grotstein said, and I think I quoted him in that article, or maybe it was in the book, but quoted him in any event, talking about how the unconscious is only unconscious to us from a human perspective. But he said, the unconscious is not unconscious. We're just unconscious of it. Right. And I just loved that twist. So anyway, roundabout perspective, you talked about reversible perspective, and Bion was talking about reversible perspective, particularly as a psychotic experience, like what it meant to literally like turn things inside out, like not be able to see something from its correct vantage point. But as any valuable symbol, it's been played with, and Grotstein played with it, and I played with it with him, to think about reversible perspective as the capacity to see from more than one perspective. So we have to be specific about which context we're looking at it in, because in order to help the person with psychosis, one has to be able to see things as best one can from the psychotic point of view, which is often one of what Bion called bizarre objects, and a lot of confusion. So reversible perspective is both the psychotic perspective, and it's also being able to help somebody inside of that psychosis by being able to see things from more than one point of view. And binocular vision is another gift that Bion gave us, thinking about what it means to be able to see things from more than one perspective. And so binocular vision was his term that really held the idea of what it means to literally see through more than one eye at the same time. Like if I had one of my eyeglasses, that was seeing you in one way, and then another one of my eyeglasses that's seeing you from another way, how can I hold those two things together at the same time? So it's really getting to that that understanding that it's not just seeing more than one thing. It's not just being able to turn things around, but binocular vision is really helping us see more than one thing at once. And we actually do it all the time. It's the condition of our seeing, of having two eyes, but we don't always realize it.
We do something very interesting where we create a stereoscopic effect out of the parallax. And if we can hold that coherently, it's like having another dimension of perception available to us.
Yes, exactly. And this was one of Grotstein's favorite terms, was stereoscopic, that he writes about a lot in his wonderful title of his book. Again, it stops me right there at the title. It's called "Who is the Dreamer Who Dreams the Dream?" And it's like the integral dictum of who is taking the subject of one stage that becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. It's like just to get that out of your mouth requires a certain figuring, and so for me, Grotstein's psychoanalytic koan, who is the dreamer who dreams the dream, is one of those beautiful phrases. But he goes quite a bit into stereoscopic listening as another way of playing with this idea with the different senses of, binocular vision, stereoscopic listening, getting to Mark Foreman's important, discussion point that one of the most important facets of integral psychology is active listening.
Reversible perspective as both a capacity and a problematic condition is fascinating because it unites the sense of development in integral thinking with the sense of the need to heal the shadow, is what came up for me. Like the very dynamic that's involved in retrogression, or in sort of experiencing part of yourself from the wrong perspective, is also a capacity that you need in order to be able to perform the perspectival flipping operation that leads to a more sophisticated perspective.
Exactly. And of course, all of that perspective taking is only in service of being able to experience those multiple realities. So that's a part of the beauty and the difficulty. I think it's why we talk about perspectives in shorthand, because it's easier to talk about the perspective than the experience.
Do you think that conventional integral thinking and maybe developmental models in general put too much emphasis on the development of the conscious, awake, socially informed personality, and not enough emphasis on the possibility that the unconscious might need to develop and grow through stages?
Well, I don't know about that, but I know that for myself, it's been one of the revelations of my experience of psychology has been joining my regard, appreciation, and ardor for pursuits of consciousness with my great regard for that which cannot be known, that which cannot be seen, and at times that which cannot even be perceived, if we want to understand the unconscious at its various depths in all of those ways, right? So I can just say from my own sense, and I write about this a little bit in my chapter on reckoning with the spiritual truth of aversive emotions, evolving unconditional positive regard, and discovering the good enough clinician. It's one chapter I have in the spiritual psyche and psychotherapy book. And in that, I really talk about how important it's been for me to join together maps of consciousness with humility for the unconscious. And I think it's why my whole practice has had these two arcs. The first as the arc of integral psychotherapy and psychology, and inclusive of the transpersonal and the expressive arts. And then the second with the relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy, because it's taken me back into this way of understanding consciousness that Grotstein was alluding to when I quoted him as saying, the unconscious is very conscious. It's just us who are unconscious of it. So it's really changed the way that I practice. It's probably, I dare say that it's one of the most fundamental shifts in my own way of being in the world, not just being a psychologist.
My traditional focus has been on spirituality, and definitely over the years I've experienced a shift from feeling like I'm doing my spiritual practice to feeling like some other entity that is present without my knowing is doing it, and I am a helper.
What a beautiful way to express that.
I've also been very interested in how something like the unconscious might show up in all the quadrants of an integral map, right? We normally think of it as a personal, subjective unconscious. But when you look at the material world, there's a great deal of dark matter and other universes and all this kind of stuff that physicists are telling us. And when you look at interbehavioral systems, well, there's all kinds of things we cannot possibly compute because they're just too complex in terms of how systems operate. When it comes to intersubjective relating, what do you think? Does a relationship have an unconscious?
Absolutely. Most definitely. And yes, I think that if we want to carry forward our metaphor from the title of Grotstein's book, A Beam of Intense Darkness, which he borrowed from Freud and company, I think we can say that beam of intense darkness, it permeates the quadrants, permeates the cosmos, and which the quadrants are, of course, a denotation and expression of. And that really relationships are probably the harbinger of how we come to recognize the unconscious, because we so often we want to be able to care for and love and be loved, and then we find these shadows that occlude our capacity to do that, either to be loved or to love, and usually some combination and dance steps between them. And I think that's how many of us first come into contact with the depth of the unconscious.
When we were talking about Bion's O, it reminds me of Wilhelm Reich because of orgasm and orgone, and what a fascinating, dynamic, insightful, provocative, disturbing person in a number of different genres of activity that this guy was. But it seems like he went from treating Freud's metaphor of the libido as actual bioelectricity in different emotional modes and bodies to eventually theorizing that bioelectricity wasn't enough, that he had to postulate an additional subtle energy of some other kind. So I wonder what your take is on the role of energy as metaphor, as physiological electricity, or as some other subtle energy of some kind in psychological dynamics, in healing, in relationship, things like that.
Yeah, what a great question. I come back to what you said about your own relationship to your spiritual practice, of feeling like one of the shifts in your experience of spiritual practice is that you're feeling like you're the helper, and that there's some other entity that is sort of doing the practice in a way. And that implies the idea of you also being helped by that other energy or field or presence. And it made me think of an article that was very important to me in my doctoral program, written by another luminary in the psychoanalytic world, Dr. Michael Eigen. And he also is a translator and an extender and an originator of Bion's work. And he's been an important mentor in this work to me as well. And he wrote this article on background presence and talked about what it meant to, in therapy, as well as just in our lives, to have this sense of a background presence that was beneficent, benevolent, beneficent and benevolent, and helping us in some way that we know not, and something that could help us in our aloneness, kind of the difference between, the times that we all experience our aloneness as contemplative reverie of quietude and solitude, and on the other hand, when we can experience aloneness as isolating imprisonment that cuts us off from others and ourselves. And I think the difference is that background presence, when we're able to make contact with it and use of it, and be able to feel into it. And I like the term background presence because for me it does what I think all good phrases or turns of psychic material or metaphors do, which is it keeps things open. There's an openness there. It's like It doesn't say it's this or that, but it doesn't say it isn't this or that. It just says background presence, and there is this overriding sense of benevolence. And to me, that's the analytic field, which is the term that I often use in my practice to connote the space in which therapy occurs, and also to think about the field as, the term that many of us use for just the proximate and distal experience of contact with a larger reality that extends beyond our knowing mind and touches the edges of it and beyond, but we can also make contact with. So I think this sense of the field is the play of energy that I'm also often thinking of in my own practice.
It sounds like faithfulness as opposed to belief. And I noticed in your conversation with Helen in the book that a lot of the discussion was around having a good relationship to mystery.
Thank you so much for reading that and feeding it back to me in this moment so that I can appreciate that truth. Because I'm so appreciative of you invoking Helen, my co-editor, Dr. Helen Marlowe. She's been such a wonderful collaborator on this project. And yes, the difference between faith and belief, I think, is really powerful. And it's one that is sort of an undercurrent of the book as we traverse different faith orientations that the various 8 authors, myself and Helen included, traversed in the process of thinking about the spiritual psyche and psychotherapy. There's 8 of us who are authors, and we hail from the United States and Israel and India as a collective. And all of us, I think, were in some way, Layman, asking, what is faith and how does it appear in our practice? I don't think I ever said those sentences in the book, but I think that that's very much a part of what the project has been.
It makes me curious about what you think are the things we can do to have a better relationship with background presence. Like, is it more like a decision or a practice we can undertake, or is it sort of a side effect of general psychophysiological health?
I think it can be all of those things. I think it can also be a side effect of psychophysiological illness. I think that there are just so many powerful life events, including our experience of different practices that create the accident-prone conditions of awakening. And some of them are bidden and some of them are unbidden. And I think that part of the, back to the mystery is we're always, as seekers, we're always wondering, how do we optimize those accidents, right? And I think, I don't know, from my own perspective, it's a wonderful synchronicity of we seek and we are being sought. In that same sense that you said about your spiritual practice of you're helping and my submission that you're being helped. That it's really those 2 hands joining each other, in like the Escher painting, right? That they're both and that they're tied together.
In the 19th and 20th century, it seems there was a lot of institutional resistance and skepticism to allowing spirituality into psychological and psychiatric work. Do you think that's changing now?
I do think it's changing. And I think that's one of the great evolutionary developments of psychology and spirituality holding hands and having more contact as we go forward, as a world, as a cosmos, as individual cultures, and certainly in the culture of psychology and in the culture of spirituality. I think that they're more, there's in exponentially increasing dialogue, which our book is one expression of.
I've done my own philosophical work trying to define religion, spirituality, and mysticism. And so I'm always a little bit concerned about whether or not people's definitions are too broad. If we try to bring in spirituality into psychology, there's a tendency to treat it as too expansive and too flexible and just, like anyone could mean anything they want by that term. What's your definition of spirituality? And are we at risk of not being able to say what is and isn't spirituality, or should that word be inherently ambiguous?
The definition of terms. We couldn't have an integral conversation without talking about the definition of terms. It's part of the play, right?
We're clarificationists.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if we're going to talk about the slice of a cosmos, we need to know what slice we're talking about so we can talk about it coherently. Absolutely. So I think, clarification and definition of terms as applied to spirituality, very helpful, very useful. But I will go against that wisdom in the next breath by saying I do like to keep it open myself, probably because of the fact that I am so interested in this conversation from our limited human perspective, the dance between the conscious and the unconscious. And so because of that, I feel like it behooves me to keep a definition of spirit and of spirituality that takes as its center point in terms of the unknowable unknown, and to have a kind of humility in the face of that. So I guess so I've done both things again in that moment, because what I did was I came back to a very specific definition, which is Bion's O, which helps me to designate in a very pithy, concise shorthand the infinite, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about the conjoining of, from the human perspective, the unconscious and the conscious mind. We're really just having a way to splice the infinite from some modicum of human graspability.
I think if we use our quasi-undefined experience to help our definition, then we're in a good spot rather than defining one against the other. Let me introduce another big defining question, which is there's many branches of psychology. They don't all agree on what they're studying or on what the psyche is. What are all these branches of? What is the subject of psychology?
The subject of psychology is the antecedent self, is O. The subject of psychology is the self that includes the all. And different branches of psychology are invested in studying different aspects of that reality, those plural realities.
It's always been very interesting to me that Ken Wilber's early work was on trying to explain, first for himself and then others, how a number of different prominent schools of psychology can all be simultaneously valid, so that he required a developmental system with a variety of fulcrums at which different styles of pathologies can emerge.
Such a great project, eh?
Yeah, fantastic place to start.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know Greg Henriquez, but he's a psychologist who set out to try to figure out how the different parts of psychology fit together, and ended up needing a developmental meta picture of the universe in order to do that.
Yeah.
So
Lovely.
it's a very powerful way into thinking of a great coherent mandala of being.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of my favorite metaphors for the antecedent self, or the O of existence, in Bion's terms, is the kaleidoscopic self.
Mm.
Um, I don't think I've written about it anywhere, but it's often been since the early 2000s a metaphor that I use in my teaching. And specifically, I think I came to talk about the kaleidoscopic self in terms of a way to think about the integral map of, what are we if we are, quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types all brought together. Then we're not just a psychograph, which we might be from a blueprint perspective, but we're a kaleidoscope from a living, animated, experiential mandala perspective. And that in that sense, we are, all the colors of the system, and we are all expressions of that system from the antecedent self perspective. But you take all of that and you put the kaleidoscope in view into binocular vision, and you see one momentary expression of that spirit.
I know you've done some work on trying to think about how psychological defenses work, given that we are these kaleidoscopic beings, and you have a 3-factor approach to psychological defenses. I saw a bit of the article, and maybe you could walk us through the category level and threat zone distinctions.
Sure. Well, I would have to say, Layman, that speaking about the defenses and the way that I work with the defenses is probably a key example of how my integral relational work has shifted to really center on the experience of transference and countertransference in the immediacy of the analytic field, because I don't I don't use the perspective of like thinking about the threat zones in the midst of an analytic exercise while I'm working with somebody. That might be something that I think about, outside of a session, but in the immediacy of a session, there's the experience of what feels threatening, right? And so it's a very direct, visceral experience that touches on the unconscious meeting the unconscious, my unconscious meeting the unconscious of the patient, and being able to feel into in that space what feels threatening. And that feels like the question to be feeling my way into as I'm working with somebody. So it doesn't come from an analytic view of, the threat zones as they've been mapped out in that article, although that could be a very useful way to expand my thinking outside of a session about what might be going on, or how might I make sense of what I'm feeling, or how might I understand some of the thoughts and feelings and sensations that have come into my orbit as a result of making contact in this session with this person. That might come later.
You're not trying to categorize them in the moment.
I'm not, but this is such an interesting both and situation, because I think that my study of the different cartographies in psychology, the integral map being a very important one to me in my life, have made me aware of more possibilities for engagement of diverse territory of that antecedent kaleidoscopic O, right? Than I would have been aware of if I hadn't done that studying, in the same way that, I've taught psychopathology twice a year for the last 4 years. And I did at Naropa as well. So it's been much longer than that. But, with every version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association and Psychological Association, there is a new cartography of psychopathology. And similarly, I do find those volumes, those cartographies, helpful in terms of thinking about diverse experience. But similarly, what I use most immediately is my direct experience. So there's a way in which my direct experience has been informed by studying those various cartographies, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. And I can say that for somebody who spent, 3 years in a master's program and 6 years in the doctoral program. Nobody's up for that kind of craziness unless, you're really interested in the maps, right? Because you really get into them. But there's a way in which that falls away when being with somebody, in the direct encounter of framing things with the simplicity and the elegance and the direct access of transference and countertransference.
Yeah, the analysis is a little bit different than the practice. This notion of transference and countertransference it's been handled different ways in psychology, right?
Yes, indeed.
Famously, Freud suggested it be done, but created a setup in which, you don't face the patient and you try to keep things a little more controlled. And then some of his successors said, well, you're not allowing the process to really begin if you do it in that controlled fashion. And yet it's dangerous to allow those processes to begin. We hope that people have some expertise when they do them professionally, but at the same time, it goes on in everyone's lives anyway. So what are some general orienting ideas to help people go through transference, countertransference engagements in a successful way?
What comes to mind is a phrase from Bion, actually, which has helped me quite a bit, so I'll extend it here, which is, he used the phrase, when two people meet, an emotional storm takes place. And I think it's true. I think whenever two people meet, unconscious to unconscious, like we're meeting now, an emotional storm takes place, whether we're aware of it or not. And it's this whole process set in motion of, who are you? Who am I? Who are we? And it's happening on the most primitive and the most transcendent planes of our being simultaneously. That whole kaleidoscope of me and that whole kaleidoscope of you are involved in this emotional storm of meeting. And I think that transference, an appreciation of transference, comes out of that recognition that there's a way. What Freud meant by it, as I understand it, is that our regressed parts that were most in need and yearning for a kind of experience with the other would be mapped onto new relationships in order to yearn for those developmental needs. And so that kind of yearning and fear and both positive and negative experience is all bound up in our transference of early relationships, commonly with caregivers or other very important primary beings or objects, as they're horribly called in psychology. And we bring them into the next occasion to try to work with, work out, work through, work up,
What do we need to understand about how to deal with seemingly opposed forces within ourselves?
Oh, you have to say that one again.
It seems like when it comes to both therapy and growth, a lot of the issue is, do we know how to handle forces within us that seem opposed to each other? And so what do we need to understand about how to handle that?
Well, this is one of the psychoanalytic koans that I take up in my book with Helen. Many different authors take it up in different ways, which is the riddle of destruction and creation. Or we could say in different spiritual systems like the Shiva Shakti dimensions, if we want to think about it in that way, or personify it or deify it in that way, but maybe more simply and in its psychological expression to just say the forces of destruction and creation. And we all come equipped, as far as I know it, as human beings with great capacity for both destruction and creation. And I think lifelong we are tasked with how to manage both forces in ways that don't destroy us, but allow us to perhaps have little deaths along the way in terms of destruction with a small d, right? And stave off the great destruction of the big death of mortality, until that comes. And hopefully to be able to presence creation along the way. But we're always managing these two forces, and they're always in contact. They're never not present. There's a beautiful chapter by Shiva Hack in the book where she talks about surviving destruction. And she takes as her points of interest Donald Winnicott, the great psychiatrist and, pediatrician and psychoanalyst, and Mahatma Gandhi. And she looks into how those theories speak to each other. It's a beautiful piece of work that she's done, but thinking about surviving destruction in the clinical setting as well. And then I take that up in my chapter on reckoning with the spiritual truth of aversive emotions, because I talk about destruction in the clinical encounter in various ways. One is what Winnicott talked about, which is the patient surviving their own destructive tendencies. And then what Eigen added to the equation was he talked about the importance of we as clinicians surviving our own destructive tendencies and capacities. And then another dimension, which Benjamin talks about, Jessica Benjamin, psychoanalyst in the relational tradition, of what it means for the patient to survive the therapist's destructive capacities. So you put all those together and there's a lot of destruction going on. And there's a lot of also room for generativity and creativity as well. And I think I don't know, your question stops me because I think it's one of the ultimate questions. And so I have been attracted to it as well for that reason. It is truly a mystery how we navigate those things, but I think that there's a world of examples of how people are contending with those two forces in ultimately creative and ultimately destructive ways.
You seem very focused on the experience of being in relationship and being in dialogue in a lot of different areas. And I'm wondering if that's just a characteristic trait that's defined you for your whole life, or is it something that you've grown into or developed?
Well, thank you for that reflection. I think it is true of me. I think that it is both characteristic and tended, for sure. And I think that my being a psychotherapist and a psychologist, over these, a psychotherapist for more than 21 years and a psychologist for more than 4 years, has been the center point of my own spiritual practice, because I work in that engagement with students and with clients for most of the hours of my week. So I think that it's definitely, clinical work, clinical training is not just the experience of being with the patient, but of course, all the supporting activities that go along with trying to help somebody as best as possible, which is doing supervision and writing notes and studying theory and being able to process all the facets of the session in that way, in service of bringing something back that's more metabolized to help the patient make better use of you, in the session. So I think that it's an endless fascination for me, these kaleidoscopes.
I was going to ask a question like, what makes the difference between PTSD and post-traumatic growth? But then I realized that would be different at each developmental level, so to speak. And then I thought, well, it must show up falsely sometimes, that some things look like they're at a certain level and they're actually at another level, which led me to want to ask instead, when people come to therapy and they have spiritual or psychological problems, how often is that physiological? How much of that would go away if they were eating right and sleeping right and exercising better, or maybe had the right chemicals in their system? How much, in your observations of people, how much of their psychology is physiological?
Well, I'm actually quite compelled by your original question.
Please.
What's the distinction between post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth? And, I think there's PTSD in its clinical sense, but there's also trauma in its ubiquitous sense, in the sense that, none of us get out of here alive. We all experience trauma with a small t in different ways throughout our lives. And some of us experience that in more harrowing forms in terms of its clinical expression of PTSD. And those distinctions are important for many reasons. But I think if we talk about trauma in its ubiquitous sense, the sense that truly all of us experience trauma just as a result of living in small ways, then what's the difference between experiencing that trauma and holding it in a traumatic state versus post-traumatic growth, which implies some way to hold something as contributing to growth or development in some way? And Robin Greenberg is one of the contributing authors to the Spiritual Psyche and Psychotherapy text, and she writes about something that is so important, and other people have written about it as well, but she talks about the fact that when people start psychotherapy, they often come to psychotherapy because they want to get rid of their suffering. And one of the most difficult things to come to appreciate is that on the path of healing, it's actually receiving our suffering that is the agent of change. And so many of us want to avoid that. It's so human for us to say, I want to get rid of this suffering. But I think the difference between experiencing trauma as something that's done to us or that we do to others, and shifting it from that, what Jessica Benjamin calls the do or done to paradigm, which we could talk about, the sort of victim oppressor paradigm that's written about so much in relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy. The way out of that, I think a way out of that, is to be able to appreciate post-traumatic growth, which is, in other words, to receive our suffering, to actually make a home for it within ourselves that allows us to metabolize it rather than run from it. Because as you know, when you're running from a monster, you can be running until the edges of the earth. And, she or he will track you down for sure because you're always running from them. And so I think it's a different moment to say, how does that monster live inside of me?
Well, that leads me to the second half of my question, because people like Peter Levine and a few others have proposed that there are layers of trauma that can't be dealt with verbally or psychologically until they're dealt with physically first, the way the animals process trauma. And so then again, I'm curious about how much of obviously people have real psychological issues at different levels, and they also have real spiritual issues. But sometimes those issues are sort of side effects of their physiological issues, where if they write it, maybe it turns out they're just not getting enough potassium or something like that. So how do you modulate dealing with people at psychospiritual levels and also keeping an eye on the fact that some of this might be physiological?
Well, it's interesting because in terms of thinking about the earliest parts of our being and the earliest, most primitive dimensions of our existence, or the most foundational, I think this is truly where the quadrants and their inseparability is so helpful as a map, because it teaches us as a map that we are relational beings from moment zero. Whatever you conceive moment zero to be, we're a relational being from that point, right? Especially if you start from you can start from our cosmic existence, you can start from our in utero experience, or you can start from our cosmic in utero experience. And whatever point as you take as the 0 point, we are relational beings from that point forward. And so I think it brings me back to this reverie for what we were talking about earlier about background presence. And I think it's really important, and this is something that psychoanalysis has been a learner of over the decades. And it's part of why the relational psychoanalytic streams, has started to emerge in the 80s and beyond, as saying, wait a minute, there's this whole strata of nonverbal experience that is part of the relational exchange that's happening moment to moment. And if we don't attend to that in our therapeutic space, we have dropped the cosmic baby,
It makes me think of, the junction point between one of the junction points between psychology and spirituality is this notion of having a second person relationship with the universe. And so on the one hand, it seems like that's very important, and that maybe our sense of self is even secondary to an experience of relationship with the other, that it loops back, and that maybe what the mystics have called God is a stabilization of our relational experience of the background of being. But on the other hand, there's this sort of Jacques Lacan notion that we're neurotically fixated on the big other, and we have to unlearn that sense of the other in order to be really sanely present in our own anxiety as human beings. How do you balance those? Or, is one the precondition for doing the other properly? Or, how do you juggle those two things?
You're making me think of Dr. Helen Marlowe's chapter in the book, in The Spiritual Psyche, where she, let me see, I'm actually wanting to get the title right, so I'm going to read it from the book because it's a beautiful and extended title. Here it is. Out of dissociation into creation through relation, a depth-oriented and Jungian perspective on psychological and spiritual experience. So it's the first part of that I really wanted to key into. Out of dissociation into creation through relation. And in that chapter, one of the things that she talks about is how many of us seek out spiritual paths and experience because we've had wounding in our interpersonal contexts, such that we seek out divine relationality. And that divine relationality, our relationship to the divine through whatever expression or formation or system or vehicle we choose, whether it be meditation or prayer or a particular teacher or community or what have you, that whatever that expression is, that we're seeking out divine relationality because human relations have failed us, have hurt us, have injured us and wounded us in some way that we don't trust those human relations to be reparative or restorative in the way that we come to trust spiritual technologies as being a vehicle for that kind of repair and resourcefulness. And of course, we need both. We need divine relationality and we need human relationality, right? So again, a sort of koan of how it is that we wrestle with both and make sense of both.
I, years ago, lived in a Buddhist community, and they had a concept of Buddhist psychology as being very closely related to neurophysiology, in the sense that we get more of the states and thoughts that we practice, that we're constantly cultivating ourselves.
Mm.
And in that case, they want to do something that a lot of the religions have wanted to do, which is specialize in the experiences you want to have.
Mm.
On the other hand, there's this energetic, maybe hydraulic tradition coming into us from psychotherapy, which says these things are lurking in you, whether you know they're there or not. And in order to free yourself, you have to integrate them by experiencing them and going through them. Right. And then the other person will say, well, you're not really just experiencing them and going through them. You're actually getting better at having them by going through them. So how do you juggle that sort of cultivationist versus expression and integrationist approach to psychotherapy?
Well, I think you cultivate them through your curiosity.
Mm.
I think that I find in my practice that I think part of what I really enjoy about the practice of psychotherapy is that states and feeling experiences are coming up all the time that, they don't typically announce themselves. They don't typically say like, hi, I'm an expression of anger. Hi, I'm an expression of sadness. I mean, sometimes they do, right? But a lot of times they're mercurial and they take a lot of curiosity to discover what their tendrils are and what their roots are and what some of the emotional landscapes are that those feelings are coming from. And I think that, again, similar to the practice of having access to multiple analytic cartographies of psychology and being able to use that in the practice of meeting another person. In the same way, I think cultivating different practices that take us into different emotional experiences can be useful to get to know them from the outside in. But I'd say that probably 85-90% of the time, because of my profession, my practice is going inside out. Discovering what's coming up, what's coming in, what's coming into the emergence of the analytic field, and then finding out what that is and working with it through curiosity, through a kind of befriending of whatever it is that emerges. And there's a great trust in that because, so this is where I would say, I have, because of my practice, that's really, it's the inside out directionality of exploring emotional landscapes that I'm versed in. I don't, myself, I'm not immersed in practices where you like try on different emotional states and give them expression, which would be like the path of, an incredible actor like Anna Deavere Smith or somebody, that's like feeling into something because you try it on. So I can just speak from that vantage point, but certainly from a conceptual point of view, I can see value in both.
There's this very interesting book. I read it when I was a kid called Focus by Eugene Genlin. I think he was a student of Carl Rogers, and he wanted to try to theorize about what made some of his interactions with patients more successful than others and what they were doing internally that made that more successful. And he came up with this notion that the more successful patients were experimentally testing words and ideas against their generalized proprioceptive feeling in order to find a temporary resonant lock that moved them one step forward in their process. So I'm curious from your point of view, what is it that makes a successful patient, a successful client? How does the patient, what do they have to do in order to help the therapy be successful?
Show up. And that's it. It takes so much to be willing just to walk in the door or, turn on the Zoom camera. It's so vulnerable to be a patient, as of course I know from my own experience of being a patient. It's just such a vulnerable experience. And really, willingness is all that's required. If you're sitting with somebody who is a skilled clinician, they should be able to open that space for you that allowed you to get there in the first place. You can bring all of your resistances, you can bring all of your, doubts about the process and skepticism, and all of that can come with. I don't think it obviates any of that. I think just maybe what it is, Layman, that I'm trying to say very simply is, again, going back to your description of spiritual practice, of you have to have, like, what does it take to say, I'd like to be your patient, and I think what it takes is to say something like, I'm interested in being helped, and I have a modicum of faith, however attenuated, that you might be able to help me.
Why is it so hard for us to ask for help?
It's a great question. It's a great question. As I think about in this moment, I think part of it comes back to our conversation about trauma and about transference, which is all of us have experiences of being unmet, of being disappointed or hurt. And so it requires a certain faith that there could be a new experience or something that could be called upon that maybe somebody has experienced in the past. Like, for example, I can think of calling on the faith of being helped in my past, like by one practitioner, and using that in service of reaching out again and saying, I could use your help.
That's a very beautiful thing. I know it's a slippery thing to apply psychology to sociology. We don't want to do that too much, but at the same time, questions of identity and resistance and aggression and hope, there's a lot of ways that psychology might be able to clarify culture for us. What's your general take on the psychological condition of culture right now, say American culture, right? There seems to be some hopeful areas, some problematic areas, several large thematic groups of people with their own individual types of pathology or danger. What's your overall psychological take on politics and culture, if you have one?
Sure. Well, I think that ultimately I am an optimist, and my optimism is rendered as looking for, experiencing, and affirming the evolution of culture. And while I say that, I will say it does not negate the reality of the dance of destruction and creation that we were talking about earlier. And to the degree that, that destruction that is also happening, in terms of cultures, in terms of ecology, in terms of political systems, that there are destructive forces at work, but there are also creative forces at work. And those creative forces at their best, metabolize, make use of, and incorporate those destructive elements in order to come back stronger and to be able to be more resilient. And so who knows how great the destruction becomes until that creative emergence, shows her face again. But nonetheless, I do believe that that's the process of evolution that we are embedded in.
What's exciting in your field that I haven't asked about?
Hmm. 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 I don't. Exciting. This is, Helen and I often joke to each other in front of students, like, we think this is exciting because, we're psychology geeks, but I don't know if other people would find it exciting. But I think actually one of the things that is really exciting is discovering how the antecedent self, that kaleidoscopic self, that experience of all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types, actually, that all of those zones of experience live in me. And I mean that as a proximate self, in terms of literally, I am all of it. I'm not estranged from any of it, ultimately. And that path of recognition is an exciting path. It's harrowing as well, but it's exciting. And I think that's why I love what I do, is that, every person that I work with, every student that I work with in the classroom, there's this way of, discovering how they live in me as well. Not from a narcissistic perspective, but from the perspective of spiritual experience. I think of the Roman playwright Terence's expression of, I am human, and I think nothing human is alien from me. And I think that in many ways can be an integral dictum, can be an integral slogan, in the sense that all levels, all lines, all types, all states, all quadrants are all me. And so how do I discover that in my day-to-day experience? By finding out all the places that I'm allergic to that reality, that I find that difficult, and that I find that attractive and exciting, and I think that journey is an exciting one.